The elevator was broken again. Nora Chen stood at the bottom of the stairwell of her building on Halsted Street, staring up at 7 flights of steps with the particular brand of exhaustion that had no name. Not tired. Past tired. The kind of hollow that lived behind your eyes and made the world look slightly too bright, slightly too loud, slightly too much. She shifted the weight of her bag groceries, mostly store brand, the kind with no pictures on the boxes, and started climbing. 3rd floor. Her feet ached from the double shift at the restaurant. 4th floor. The tip money in her apron pocket totaled $31. 5th floor. The eviction notice she'd collected from the mailbox was folded into a tight square in her jacket. She hadn't opened it. She already knew what it said. 6th floor. The lights on this landing had been out for 3 weeks, and the landlord had stopped returning her calls. 7th floor. She stood in front of apartment 714 and pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the door. Just for a second. Just breathe. Inside, she dropped her bag on the kitchen counter and didn't turn on the lights. She'd learned that darkness was cheaper than electricity and easier than looking at the apartment the way it really was, small, worn, full of second-hand furniture that had belonged to other people's better lives. She sat at the kitchen table and put the eviction notice in front of her. Opened it. 14 days. 14 days to produce 3 months of back rent or vacate. She did the math quickly, the way she always did math now, like a person running from something. She had $412 in her checking account. She owed $4,200. The number sat there in the dark. Nora was 27 years old. She had a degree in graphic design that had cost her $60,000 and gotten her a series of internships that paid in exposure and a restaurant job that paid in cash. She had no family in the city her parents were in Phoenix, and calling them meant explaining, and explaining meant admitting, and admitting meant hearing the particular silence her mother made when she was trying not to say "I told you so." She had friends who had slowly become people she used to know, the natural erosion of being too tired to show up, too broke to split the bill, too ashamed to explain why she kept canceling. She sat in the dark for a long time. Then, she opened her laptop. The ad was still there. She'd found it 3 days ago, had closed it, had come back to it twice, had talked herself out of it both times. It sat in a folder she'd titled, with grim humor, "Absolutely Not." The website was clean and minimal, no photographs, no names, just text on a white background. Seeking one individual for a single evening arrangement. Attendance required at a formal private event. No personal details will be exchanged. No contact afterward. Compensation, $10,000 deposited upon arrival. She had read it so many times the words had lost their shape. $10,000. It was not an escort listing. She had checked. Had read the fine print 3 times, had searched the host organization's name, and found it attached to a series of legitimate charity events and real estate holdings, and the kind of old money that didn't need to advertise itself. The arrangement was simple. Attend an event. Play a role. Leave. A companion for an evening. A placeholder. She told herself she was just going to look at it one more time. At 11:45 p.m., she sent the inquiry. At 11:47 p.m., she received a reply. The details were sparse. A car would collect her the following evening. She should wear something formal. She would be briefed on arrival. The $10,000 would transfer upon entry. If she chose to leave at any point during the evening, she was free to do so, and $500 would be provided for her time regardless. It was the last line that made her believe it was real. Scams didn't offer exit clauses. She sat with the laptop open until 2 in the morning, reading and rereading, turning the decision over in her hands like a stone. Then she thought about the eviction notice on the table. She thought about her mother's silence. She thought about climbing those 7 flights of stairs for the rest of her life, or not being able to, because there would be no apartment to climb toward. She wrote back, "I'll be ready at 7. She slept better than she had in months. The car was a black town car, the kind with tinted windows and a driver who didn't speak unless spoken to. Nora sat in the back in the only formal dress she owned, navy blue, bought second-hand for a job interview 2 years ago, pressed 3 times this evening until the fabric held its shape through sheer determination. She watched the city change outside the window, her neighborhood, then the better neighborhood, then the neighborhood that didn't have a name because people who lived there didn't need one. The building they stopped in front of was old in the way that only money could preserve. Stone facade, iron railings, the kind of architecture that said we have always been here and we will be here long after you are gone. There were no signs, no event banners, just 2 figures in dark coats flanking the entrance and a door that opened before she reached it. A woman appeared at her elbow, mid-40s, severe dark suit, silver hair pulled back with the kind of precision that suggested she had never once in her life been caught off guard. Miss Chen, she said it the way people said names when they'd read them from a file. "Welcome, I'm Vera. I'll be walking you through tonight's arrangement." "What is the arrangement, exactly?" Nora asked. She had promised herself she would ask directly. She had spent 27 years being polite when she should have been direct, and she was trying to stop. Vera looked at her with something that might have been approval. "You are here to attend a formal gathering as a guest of the house. You will be introduced as an associate. You will not be asked to speak at length. You will not be asked to do anything that makes you uncomfortable. You will eat excellent food, stand in beautiful rooms, and leave at midnight with $10,000 and a car home." "And the host?" Vera paused. 1 beat. Just 1. "He is a private man. He values discretion above all else. Tonight is a business obligation he would prefer to navigate with company rather than without it." Nora nodded. That she understood. She had spent years making herself useful to people who needed something filled in. The money transferred to her account at the door. She checked her phone, saw the number, felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. She walked inside. The entrance hall was the kind of room that made you feel like you had arrived somewhere important without knowing why. High ceilings with plasterwork that had no right to be that detailed, dark wood floors that gleamed like still water, and chandeliers that scattered light in patterns Nora's design brain immediately started cataloging warm amber, not white, deliberately chosen, the kind of lighting that made everyone look like a better version of themselves. She followed Vera through the hallway and into a large reception room where perhaps 60 people stood in small groups, all dressed in the quiet, expensive way of people who had nothing to prove. No sequins, no statement pieces, just fabric that draped correctly and jewelry that caught light without asking for attention. Nora looked down at her pressed navy dress and felt the familiar calculus of not quite right. Vera stopped at the edge of the room. "He'll be a few minutes. Stand here. Take a drink from the tray when it passes. Look comfortable. Can I ask what he looks like?" "You'll know him," Vera said, and walked away. That was not an answer. Nora took a glass of something pale and cold from a passing tray and stood at the edge of the room and watched people. She had always been good at watching. It was a skill that came from years of being the person in the room who didn't quite belong you, learned to read the room before the room read you. She watched the clusters and could feel the invisible architecture of allegiance and tension. 2 men near the fireplace who kept glancing at the door. A woman in green who smiled at everyone and watched everything. An older couple who moved through the room like they owned the air in it. Then she felt it. It wasn't a sound or a movement. It was more like a shift in pressure, the way the atmosphere changed before a storm. The room didn't go quiet, that would have been too obvious, but something in the collective body language of 60 people adjusted. Subtly, the way people adjust when someone powerful enters a space and they don't want to be caught noticing. Nora turned. He stood at the far entrance. Her first thought was that he was tall. Her second thought, following immediately, was that tall was not the right word. He was the kind of person who occupied space differently than other people, as though the room had arranged itself around him without being asked. Dark hair. Sharp features. A suit so dark it was almost black, worn with the ease of someone who had never once in their life dressed to impress. And his eyes, when they found hers across the room, were the color of deep water. Not blue, not gray. Both, and neither, the kind of color that changed depending on the light. He walked toward her, and the room adjusted again, conversations continuing but spines straightening, gazes flickering. Nobody stared directly. Everyone noticed. Miss Chen. His voice was low and unhurried, a voice that had learned long ago that it didn't need to raise itself to be heard. "I'm told you're here as my guest this evening." "You're told correctly," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I'm Kale." Just Kale? Just Kale tonight. She accepted that. She had agreed to discretion after all. "My name is Nora." "But you already know that." "I do." He accepted a drink from the tray without looking at it, his eyes still on her. "I appreciate you coming on short notice. I appreciate the compensation," she said, and immediately wondered if that was too blunt. But he smiled then, a real one, brief and slightly surprised, and she decided she had been right to be direct. The evening moved in the way of formal events slowly, and then in rushes, punctuated by conversations Nora participated in, with the surface of her attention, while the rest of it kept returning to Kyle. He was, she noted with professional detachment, extraordinarily good at rooms. He said little. He listened in a way that made people feel chosen. He had the gift of stillness, the ability to remain motionless while everyone around him moved, and to make that stillness feel like attention rather than absence. He stayed close to her. Not crowding there was always an arm's length of space, but present, in the way of someone who had decided she was his orientation point for the evening. At one point, a man with silver cufflinks and the smile of someone who charged by the hour approached and said something to Kale in a low voice that Nora couldn't hear. Kale's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness shifted, a tightening, almost imperceptible. He glanced at Nora. "Would you excuse me for 10 minutes?" "Of course." She watched him cross the room and disappear through a side door with the silver cufflinks man. She watched the room recalibrate in his absence, like a tide adjusting to the moon. Vera materialized at her elbow. "You're doing well. I'm just standing here." "That is," Vera said with complete seriousness, "more difficult than it sounds in a room like this." Nora looked at her. "What kind of room is this exactly?" Vera smiled for the first time, the kind where what you don't say matters more than what you do. She moved away before Nora could ask a follow-up. Kyle returned 12 minutes later. She knew because she'd counted. He came back to her side with the seamlessness of someone returning to a position they'd already decided was theirs. He didn't explain the absence. The room thinned slowly pairs, and groups drifting toward exits with the unhurried certainty of people who had cars waiting. At 11:50, Kyle turned to her. "There's a matter I need to address before midnight. It requires a witness." He paused. "It's a formality. Vera can explain." Nora looked at him. In the warm amber light, he was difficult to read, not cold, not unkind, but sealed in the way of someone who had learned that expression was a form of exposure they couldn't afford. "What kind of formality?" she asked. "The kind that requires a signature and takes approximately 4 minutes. She should have asked more questions. She would think about that later, lying in a bedroom she didn't recognize, staring at a ceiling she had never seen before, wearing a ring she had not put on herself, she would think about how easy it had been to agree to something she didn't understand, because a man with deep water eyes had called it a formality, and her bank account had just received $10,000, and she had spent so long saying yes to things just to survive that the word no had become a stranger in her mouth. She said, "Lead the way." He led the way. The room they entered was small and very quiet. Wood-paneled walls, a fireplace with low flame, a desk with 2 chairs facing it and one behind it, where an elderly man in a dark suit sat with the gravity of someone whose entire profession was wait. There was a document on the desk, and standing to the side, Vera and 2 others. Nora didn't recognize a woman with the posture of someone trained for ceremony, and a man whose role she couldn't immediately place, but whose presence felt official in the way of people who existed to make things legal. Nora looked at Kyle. "What is this?" He held her gaze. His voice, when he spoke, was even, controlled, the voice of someone delivering information they had carefully organized. "I need to explain something to you," he said, "and I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is the truth, and that you are free to leave this room at any point. The car outside will take you wherever you want to go." She waited. Her heart was doing something unusual. Not racing, more like clarifying, the way it sometimes did when she was standing at the edge of something she didn't understand, and her body knew it before her brain caught up. He said, "I am the head of a house. In the tradition of my family, and it is a very old tradition, certain agreements are made through formal ceremony. Tonight was not merely a social occasion. It was an assessment. An assessment. Yes," she looked at the document on the desk. "Of what? Of suitability." His jaw tightened, just slightly. "I realize that is not a comfortable word." She almost laughed. It wasn't funny, but the alternative was panic, and she had always chosen almost laughter over panic as a survival strategy. "You assessed me, without telling me what you were assessing me for. I arranged the event. I provided the compensation regardless of outcome. You had full freedom to leave. That's not the same as informed consent." "No, it is not. And I owe you an apology for that." He said it plainly, without decoration. The apology was short and complete, and it caught her off guard because she hadn't expected it, and her body didn't know what to do with things she hadn't expected. She looked at the document again. "What does it say?" "It is a formal agreement, a binding one, by the laws of my house. It documents a union between 2 parties." Nora was quiet for 3 full seconds. "A union," she repeated. "A marriage. By our tradition, it requires the consent of both parties, witnessed and signed. It is not." "Let me stop you there." She heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. "You are telling me that tonight was an evening designed to end in a marriage proposal, in a marriage agreement. There is a distinction. I'm going to need you to explain that distinction very carefully." He did. He spoke for several minutes, his voice steady and meticulous, laying out the architecture of something that was so far outside Nora's frame of reference that she had to listen the way she listened to foreign films, not catching every word, but tracking the emotional shape of what was being communicated. An old house. An old obligation. An heir who had delayed this particular duty for longer than was conventional. An agreement that, once signed, would provide the other party with legal protection, financial security, a formal standing, and that could, if both parties agreed, be dissolved in 7 years by mutual consent. 7 years, she said when he stopped. 7 years is the minimum term under our law. Your law. Yes, she sat down in one of the chairs in front of the desk. Nobody had told her she could sit, and nobody told her she couldn't, and she needed to be lower to the ground because the room was doing something strange. He waited. He was, she would notice later, very good at waiting. Most powerful people weren't. They filled silence with more talking, with pressure disguised as conversation. He simply stood and let her think, and didn't try to manage what she was feeling with his words. She said, "What does your family do?" A pause. Then, "Many things. For a very long time." "Are you dangerous?" "Not to you." She looked at him. In the firelight, his eyes were more gray than blue, and there was something in his face that she was beginning to read, not warmth, exactly, but the deliberate suppression of something that could have been warmth, held back the way you held a door barely open. He was afraid, she realized. Not of her. Of the answer she was about to give. She thought about the eviction notice. She thought about $4,200 and $412 in the bank. She thought about 7 flights of stairs and a degree that cost $60,000 and $31 in tips. She thought about the city outside, massive and indifferent, full of opportunities that cost money to reach. She thought about the word no and how it had become a stranger in her mouth. She looked at the document. 7 years, she said again. Yes, and after 7 years, you may leave, with a full settlement, formal release, and no further obligation. And if I don't want to leave after 7 years? He looked at her for a long moment. That, he said carefully, would be a different conversation. She picked up the pen. She told herself it was practical. She told herself she was not a romantic and never had been, and this was a transaction, clear and bounded, like a lease agreement or a contract with her bank. She told herself that the way he had stood and waited without pressuring her meant something, even if she couldn't name what it meant yet. She signed the document. The elderly man behind the desk countersigned. The witnesses signed. Vera produced a ring from somewhere dark metal, a single stone the color of deep water, exactly the color of his eyes, and Kael slid it onto her finger with the careful solemnity of someone performing an act they understood the weight of. The room was very quiet. Nora looked at the ring on her hand. Then she looked up at him. "So, we're married," she said. "We are. What happens now?" He looked at her with those deep water eyes, and for the first time all evening something moved in them that she couldn't categorize. "Now," he said, "you come home." Home was not an apartment building. Home, as it turned out, was a compound on the northern edge of the city that Nora had driven past on the expressway 100 times without ever really seeing a property screened from the road by a dense line of old trees, visible only as glimpses of stone and dark windows between the trunks. Up close, it was a manor house, the kind that existed in period dramas and the architectural history books she'd used in college. 3 stories, stone that had gone dark with age and weather, windows that were taller than necessary and deeply set, like eyes under heavy brows. The car pulled through iron gates that opened without anyone visibly operating them. Nora sat in the back seat with the ring on her hand and watched the house approach. Kael sat beside her. He hadn't touched her since the ring, hadn't crowded her, or leaned in, or done any of the things that fear had been quietly preparing her for on the drive. He sat at a careful distance and looked out his own window and allowed her the space of her thoughts, which were moving very fast and in several directions simultaneously. The car stopped. Vera was already at the door impossibly. She had been at the manor and yet she'd been at the event, which meant either there were 2 Veras or she'd arrived by a route faster than the car, and Nora filed that question away in a category she was building in her mind called Things I Need to Understand. "This way," Vera said. "I'll show you to your rooms. Your rooms. Not your room." Which Nora noticed. The inside of the manor was not what she'd expected. She had been bracing herself for cold stone floors, tapestries, the gothic gloom of money so old it had stopped trying to look modern. Instead, it was warm. Real warmth, from fireplaces she could hear and feel, and the light throughout was amber and low. Similar to the event, someone had decided long ago that this house would be lit as if it were always late evening, and had committed to that decision with the thoroughness of principle. The rooms Vera showed her to were on the second floor. A sitting room, a bedroom, a bathroom, with a deep tub and towels folded with the precision of a hotel that had never lowered its standards in its entire existence. Your things will arrive tomorrow. Vera set a key on the table by the door. Breakfast is served from 7. There are no locked doors in the common areas. His Majesty will speak with you in the morning. His Majesty, Nora repeated. Vera's face offered nothing. Sleep well, Miss Chen. She was gone. Nora stood in the center of the sitting room and turned very slowly, taking inventory the way she always took inventory of unfamiliar spaces, exits first, then light sources, then the details that told you who lived here and how. The sitting room had books on 2 walls, floor to ceiling, the kind of books that had been read and returned imprecisely, spines at slight angles, some turned backward. A desk by the window, a chair near the fire that had been sat in so often the fabric had shaped itself to a body, fresh flowers on the table, white, the kind that smelled clean without being sweet. Someone had prepared this room for a person. She went to the window and looked out. The grounds in the dark were enormous, trees and what looked like gardens, and, far to the east, a wall. Not a fence. A wall. The kind built by people who understood that the difference between a fence and a wall was a statement about permanence. She sat on the edge of the bed. She was married. The word was strange in all the ways you would expect, and also in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had imagined, in the abstract way of someone who had been too busy surviving to think concretely about the future, that if she ever married it, would be a choice made with her whole self, in a direction she had walked toward for a long time. Not a pen on a desk. Not a firelit room with an elderly man in a dark suit and a ring the color of deep water. Not a man whose last name she did not know. She looked at the ring. It was heavier than it looked. The stone caught the firelight and held it in a way that normal stones didn't, and she turned her hand to watch the light move and told herself she was just tired, and the light in this house was unusual, and that was all. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did sleep, she dreamed about deep water, not drowning, not afraid, just standing at the edge of something vast and looking at the surface, and knowing, with the certainty that only dreams provided, that what was underneath was not what she expected. Breakfast was set in a small dining room off the main hall, a table for 2, which told her the household had decided not to leave the matter of mourning ambiguous. Kyle was already there when she arrived, sitting with coffee and a newspaper, an actual physical newspaper, which struck her as either charming or anachronistic. She hadn't decided yet. He stood when she entered. She noted that. It was the kind of automatic courtesy that came from a long time of practice, not performance. She sat across from him. A plate appeared from somewhere she hadn't seen anyone with food arranged with the same artful precision as the event the night before. "You didn't sleep," he said. It wasn't a question. "I slept eventually." He nodded. He looked different in daylight still contained, still that quality of careful stillness, but less formal. The suit was dark but simpler. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that she hadn't noticed in the amber evening light. "I owe you more explanation," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You do." He looked at her with something that might have been relief, as though he had been afraid she would perform civility, and was glad she hadn't. He set down the newspaper. He talked for a long time. She listened. The house was old. Not metaphorically old historically. Practically. Structurally old. The kind of old that predated records and existed in the spaces between official histories. His family had always been what they were. The human world moved around them, and they moved carefully through the human world, and the arrangement had held for longer than modern cities had existed. She let him talk, until he reached a natural pause. Then she said, "What are you?" He looked at her directly. He said the word simply, without ceremony or drama, in the same voice he would have used to say the sky was dark or the fire was warm. She sat with that for a moment. She said, "I need more coffee." He poured it for her himself. She spent the first week learning the house. Not because anyone told her to, no one told her to do anything, which was itself a form of information, but because she was a person who managed unfamiliar territory by mapping it, and the manor was unfamiliar in ways that went beyond its size. It was alive with routines she didn't understand yet, organized around a set of internal logics she could sense but not read, like a language she could hear but not translate. She walked the common areas every morning before breakfast. Library enormous, floor to ceiling, books in languages she recognized and several she didn't, organized by a system that wasn't alphabetical and wasn't chronological, and took her 3 days to decode before she realized it was organized thematically by emotional register, which told her something significant about the person who had organized it. Drawing room with windows facing east. Formal dining room clearly never used. A conservatory at the back of the house, filled with plants that grew with the aggressive confidence of things that had never been told they might not survive, and staff who moved through all of it with the efficiency of a theater company mid-performance, present when needed, invisible when not, communicating through a network of awareness she couldn't see. Kyle was present at breakfast and occasionally at dinner, and available, she understood. In between, she had only to ask Vera to locate him, and Vera would produce him within a reasonable interval, though she tried not to think of it that way, because it felt like summoning. Their conversations were careful at first, structured, almost the architecture of two people who understood they needed to know each other, and were approaching that necessity with the professionalism of people who had agreed to a contract. He told her things in increments. The history of the house. The structure of his world not hidden from the human world, exactly, but existing alongside it in a parallel register, and the relationship between the two was managed through old agreements and careful distance, and a kind of discretion that had kept the arrangement intact for centuries. There were others, other houses, other old families, other arrangements that had evolved or dissolved or held, depending on the character of those maintaining them. And there were those who didn't maintain them, who believed the old agreements were constraints rather than protections, who had in recent years been testing the edges. "Is that why you needed a witness last night?" she asked one morning. At the signing. Not just a formality witness. He looked at her across the breakfast table. She had learned by now that he gave himself a moment before answering anything that mattered, not to stall, but to think he was exact with his words in the way of someone who had learned that imprecision was a form of damage. The signing was real in every sense, he said. But yes, there are those who would contest an agreement made without witnesses. It needed to be unambiguous. Because of the testing at the edges. Yes, she considered this. So I'm not just a wife. I'm a declaration. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I should have told you that, clearly. You should have told me everything clearly." Yes. He kept saying yes to the things he'd done wrong, and she kept waiting for him to find a way to reframe them, and he kept not doing it, and she found that the honesty sat uncomfortably in her chest, because it was easier to be angry at someone who was defending themselves. She asked, after 10 days, "May I work here? I have a laptop. I freelance in design. I'm not going to," she paused, "disappear into the house. I need work." He looked at her with what she was beginning to recognize as the version of his face that meant he was recalibrating something. "Of course," he said. "Whatever you need." Then, after a moment, "You said, disappear into the house." "Yes." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Some who come here do." "The house is consuming?" I was going to say persuasive. He looked faintly uncomfortable in the way of someone naming a thing they'd been aware of, but hadn't said aloud before. "It is very good at becoming the whole world if you let it." She filed that away alongside everything else she was filing away, in the category of things that were important to understand and were still becoming clear. She set up a workspace in the library. Not the desk by the window in her rooms, which felt too private, too much like she was retreating. The library had a large central table, and the light was good in the afternoons, and the books created a kind of structured company that she found studying. She worked on her freelance projects, a logo for a small restaurant group, a brand identity for an architectural firm, the quiet, steady work of someone who had learned to keep income unpredictable at bay with volume. Kyle found her there on the third afternoon. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Before she noticed him, she always seemed to notice him a beat after he appeared, as though her awareness of him was calibrated slightly differently than her awareness of other people. He had a book under one arm, and he looked at her workspace with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "You're using the center table. Is that all right?" He crossed to one of the armchairs near the fireplace and opened his book. "It's my preferred spot for afternoons." He said it without inflection. "But I can move." "You were here first." She started gathering her things. "No. Stay." He was already seated, already reading. She stayed. They spent the afternoon in parallel, the only sounds the fire and the occasional page turning, and, outside, the wind moving through the old trees. It was the most comfortable she had felt since arriving, not because anything had been resolved, but because they had found, without negotiating it, a way to be in the same space without requiring anything from each other. She was a person who needed solitude to function and had always found shared silence rare. He appeared to be the same. She noted this. She noted a lot of things about him, assembling them carefully, the way she assembled reference material for a design project, building a picture from pieces before she had to commit to interpretation. It was Vera who told her about the others. Not directly. Vera was not a direct person, or rather she was a person who delivered information at angles, letting you turn it and hold it yourself until it resolved into meaning. She came to the library one afternoon when Nora was alone and set a tea tray on the end of the table and said, without preamble, "There will be visitors at the end of the week." "What kind of visitors?" "Representatives of 2 other houses. They come periodically when a significant change occurs within a house." She paused. "Your arrival constitutes a significant change." Nora looked at her. "Will they be a problem?" Vera poured the tea with the precision of someone performing a ritual. "Some of them will look at you and see an opportunity. Some will look at you and see a complication. A few may look at you and see nothing at all, which is in its own way the most dangerous response. Why? Because it means they've already decided what to do about you, and don't feel the need to assess you first." Nora wrapped her hands around the teacup. "What do they want from him?" "From His Majesty." Vera corrected with a gentle weight on the pronoun. "Various things. What they want from you is simpler. They want to know if you are a weakness. Am I?" Vera looked at her for the first time directly, with an assessment so thorough and unhurried that it felt like being read. "That," she said, "depends entirely on what you do with the next several days." She left the tray and left Nora with the tea and the fire and the knowledge that the house had just shifted around her in a way that was going to require her to shift with it. She found Cale that evening. He was in a room she hadn't been in before, a kind of study adjacent to the main hall, with maps on the walls and a long table covered in documents that he was moving through, with the focused efficiency of someone doing work that was also a form of managing anxiety. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the slight reconfiguration of his expression, the thing he did when she appeared unexpectedly, which she had started to think of as a kind of recalibration. "Vera told me about the visitors." He set down the document in his hand. "Yes, I was going to tell you this evening. Tell me now." He told her. The structure of it was political in the way that things are political when they are also personal. The visiting houses were not enemies, exactly, but they operated on a logic of advantage, always measuring the balance of power between the great families, always ready to shift allegiance toward strength and away from exposure. His decision to formalize a marriage to a human, to someone unknown, quickly and without the long consultation that such decisions conventionally required, had created conversation. The visitors were coming to assess the decision, which meant they were coming to assess her. What do they need to see? She asked. That you are a person of substance, he said. Not in wealth, not in history, in character. She thought about that. How do I show character to people who are looking for weaknesses? He looked at her steadily. You don't perform it. You don't try to impress them. You remain exactly what you are. He paused. The question is whether who you are will be enough. She could have been offended by that. She chose not to be, because it wasn't unkindness, it was accuracy. He didn't know yet who she was in any full sense. Neither did she, entirely, in this context. Who do you need me to be? She asked. He shook his head, and for the first time she saw something unguarded in his face, something that wasn't the careful management of impression, but was instead just him. Just the thing underneath all the stillness. I don't need you to be anyone other than what you are. I made that mistake once before, he said. Asking someone to be something for the house rather than for themselves. I don't intend to repeat it. The sentence sat in the air between them, and she wanted to ask about it, but the shape of the conversation didn't allow it yet. So she left it there and stored it in the category of things she was building toward understanding. I'll need to know the specific dynamics before they arrive, she said instead. Who defers to whom? Who is looking for what? I'm a designer. I work in context. Give me the information and I'll figure out how to show up. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, he picked up his document and moved it aside, and pulled out a chair across from himself and said, Sit down. She sat. He talked for 2 hours. She listened, asked questions, took mental notes with the efficiency of someone who had trained herself to retain what she heard, because she'd never been able to afford to miss information. By the end of it, she had a picture imperfect, partial, the way all pictures were before you had been in the room of what she was walking into at the end of the week. Before she left, she stopped at the door. You said you'd made that mistake before. Asking someone to be something for the house. He didn't look up from the table. Yes. What happened? A pause, long enough to have weight. She left, he said, before the 7 years, which she had every right to do. Nora looked at him. There was nothing theatrical in how he said it, nothing that asked for sympathy, just a fact delivered in the tone of someone who had long since finished the harder work of processing it, and was left only with its outline. She said, I'm not her. He looked up. I'm telling you that as information, she clarified, not as a reassurance, just so you have it. He held her gaze, then he nodded, once, with the weight of someone who had received something they hadn't known how to ask for. She went back to her rooms. She lay awake for a while, looking at the ceiling, turning the ring on her finger without thinking about it, the way you turn something familiar in a hand that is still learning its shape. The visitors arrived on a Thursday, 3 from the northern house, an older man with the deliberate authority of someone who had been the most significant person in every room for so long that significance had become structural. A woman of perhaps 40, with intelligence behind her eyes and no warmth in front of it, and a younger man who stood half a step behind the older man and whose primary function appeared to be observation. 2 from the coastal house, sisters, Nora determined within the first 5 minutes, from the particular shorthand of their interactions. The older was formal in the way of someone performing formality from habit. The younger was curious in a way that was almost aggressive. She looked at everything with the hunger of someone cataloging. They gathered for dinner in the formal dining room, which had been, Nora understood now, precisely why the formal dining room existed. She dressed carefully. Not to impress, she had committed to Cale's instruction to remain herself, but with the specific intentionality of a person who knew that clothes communicated before mouths did, and she wanted to communicate correctly. She wore black, simply cut, the ring visible. Deliberate choices. She was not trying to look like someone from this world. She was trying to look like someone comfortable in their own. Kyle came to her door to walk her down. He looked at her for a moment when she opened it. Then he said, "Ready?" She said yes. He offered his arm. The gesture was formal, appropriate to the occasion, but his hand when she took it was warm, and he held her arm with a steadiness that was not performative, and she understood that whatever else this evening was, he wanted her there with him, not as an object of display, but as a person beside him. That mattered. They walked down together. She watched the room absorb them as they entered. The Northern Elder's gaze moved over her with the precision of appraisal. The Coastal sisters exchanged a look. The younger observer stepped infinitesimally forward. Nora looked at none of them directly. She looked at the room, the table, the fire, the arrangement of the space, the way she looked at any project she was about to work in. Getting her bearings, not performing ease, actually finding it. Dinner moved through its courses. The conversation was layered in the way of gatherings where the real business is never the announced subject, ostensibly about shared history, territorial concerns, recent events in the wider network of houses, but underneath about Nora, always returning to Nora with the oblique persistence of a current beneath a surface. The Northern Elder addressed her directly for the first time over the third course. "You came from outside the world," he said. A plain statement, not quite hostile, not quite neutral. "Yes," she said. "How do you find it?" "Larger than it looks from the outside. More organized." She paused. "More afraid than I expected." The table was very briefly quiet. The elder raised his eyebrows. "Afraid of what?" "Of what changes when boundaries shift," she said. "I understand that. In my work, I've watched organizations react to new elements with exactly this kind of structured concern." She held his gaze. "It's not personal. It's preservation instinct. The trick is figuring out whether what you're preserving is actually worth protecting, or whether you've been protecting the form of something and forgotten the substance." The elder looked at her for a long moment. Then, at KL. Then, back at her. He picked up his wine glass. The younger observer, she noticed, had written nothing down, but was very still in the way of someone recording. The Coastal Elder was more direct. She waited until after dinner, in the drawing room, when the groups had loosened their formation and people were moving more freely, and she found Nora near the window and stood beside her with the particular posture of someone who had chosen this positioning deliberately. "You're practical," she said. "I try to be." Not what they expected. What did they expect? Something softer, someone he could manage easily. Nora looked at the woman. "And is that what you expected?" A pause. "Then, I expected someone who didn't know what she'd agreed to." The woman's voice shifted. Just slightly. "I was wrong about that. I didn't know everything when I agreed," Nora said honestly. "I still don't. But I know enough to know that not knowing everything doesn't mean you can't make decisions. You just make them with what you have, and you stay honest about the gaps." The woman looked at her with an expression that for the first time that evening was not assessment. It was something cleaner. Something closer to respect. She moved away without another word. Kyle found Nora at the window an hour later. The evening was winding down. Coats were being retrieved. Cars called. He stood beside her, and they watched the visitors make their exits with the elaborate ceremony of people who never simply left a room. When the last car had disappeared down the drive, he said, "That went well." "Did it?" "The elder from the north thinks you're dangerous." He said it neutrally. Diagnostically. "Is that bad?" He considered. In this world, dangerous is not always a disadvantage. It depends on the direction of the danger. She looked at him sideways. "What does he think I'm dangerous to?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think he hasn't decided yet." She turned back to the window. The ring on her hand caught the light from the fire behind them and held it briefly. a small, deep-water glow. She thought about the eviction notice, the 7 flights of stairs, the $31 in her apron. She thought about how far she was from that apartment, and what it would mean to go back, whether she even could, whether the person who had lived that life was still the same person wearing this ring in this house, watching old-world cars disappear into the dark. She thought about the word home and all the ways it had stopped meaning what she'd thought it meant. Kyle said, quietly, "Thank you." "For tonight." She said, "You're welcome." Then after a moment, "I have more questions." "I know," he said. "I have more answers." They stood at the window a while longer, the house quiet around them, the night outside very dark and very old. 3 weeks into her life at the manor, Nora found the garden. Not the formal gardens she could see from the upper windows, those she'd known about, the manicured geometry of boxwood and stone paths. This was something else. Through a door at the back of the conservatory that she'd assumed was a utility entrance, a stone path led into what had once been a kitchen garden and had become, over what she estimated to be decades of selective neglect, something between a wilderness and an archive. Old roses gone structural, herb beds still producing despite their abandonment, trees that had been planted for purpose and had outlived their purpose and continued anyway. She spent an hour there the first afternoon, just walking. When she came back inside, Vera was waiting in the conservatory doorway with an expression that suggested she had been watching. "I didn't know that was back there," Nora said. "Few people do," Vera said. "His Majesty's wife planted most of it. His first wife." She paused on first with the deliberate precision of someone placing a piece of information where it could be found. She had a preference for things that grew without instruction. Nora looked back through the glass at the wild garden. What was she like? Vera considered. Principled, she said finally. Uncompromising, she believed very strongly in what she believed in. And when she left, the house changed. Vera said it plainly. He changed. He became more careful, Nora supplied. Yes, more careful. Vera looked at her. He was not always so still. She left Nora with that, and went back to being invisible in the way of the manor's staff. Nora went back to the garden the next day, and the day after. She started working in it not out of sentimentality, but because she had always needed to do things with her hands when she needed to think, and the garden gave her hands something to do while her mind worked. She cleared the paths first, then the beds that were most reclaimed. She found tools in a low stone shed, old but clean, cared for, as though someone had maintained them against the possibility of use. She found KL there on the 4th day. He stood at the edge of the stone path, looking at the work she'd done, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something complicated, something that was feeling several things at once and hadn't organized them yet. "I'm sorry if this was," she began. "No." He shook his head. He walked forward slowly, into the garden, stopping at one of the old rose structures, touching the wood of the training frame with 2 fingers. "She planted these." "I know. Vera told me. Is it all right that I'm out here?" He turned to look at her. His face in the outdoor light was different from how he looked inside, less composed, somehow, as though the controlled amber of the house was a form of armor and daylight got through it differently. Yes, more than all right. She went back to the bed she'd been clearing. After a moment, she heard him sit down on the low stone bench at the garden's edge. She worked for a while. He sat and watched her, not speaking. There was a version of this that would have been uncomfortable being observed in silence, but this wasn't that. It was more like the afternoons in the library, 2 people in parallel, not requiring anything. Eventually she said, without looking up, she left because you asked her to be something for the house. A long pause. "Not exactly," he said. "I asked nothing of her. But the house asked things. The obligation of it. The structure. She wanted a life with fewer walls." He was quiet for a moment. I don't think I understood at the time how the house can become the walls. Do you understand it now? I'm still learning the difference between structure that holds something together and structure that holds something in. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was looking at the roses, at the wild climbing roses that had gone far beyond their training structure and were now just growing in whatever direction they chose. She said, I grew up in a very small apartment in Phoenix. 2 bedrooms, 5 people. I used to sit on the fire escape at night and look at the city and feel both trapped and like the city was possibility. Both at once, every time. She paused. I've always lived in the middle of contradictions. I'm not afraid of them. He turned from the roses and looked at her. Most people want contradictions resolved, he said. I know. She turned back to the garden bed. But resolving them usually means losing something true. The garden was quiet except for the wind and the sounds of her working, and somewhere far away a bird she didn't recognize. He came back to the garden the following day without being asked. And the day after that. They developed a rhythm. She worked. He sometimes helped and mostly watched, and occasionally talked not about the house or the politics of his world, but about other things. The gradual disclosure of a person who had been careful for a long time and was making small decisions about what to uncage. He'd read everything, in the way of someone with centuries at their disposal and a mind that had never stopped wanting to fill itself. He had opinions about architecture, about design, about the difference between things that aged well and things that merely survived. He was funny, occasionally dry, deadpan, the humor of someone who had decided not to perform it, but didn't mind if you caught it. She found herself looking forward to the garden. She found herself looking forward to him. She noted this carefully, the way she noted everything, turning it over and placing it precisely where it belonged, not denying it, not elaborating it into something it wasn't yet, just holding it honestly, the way she tried to hold everything. It was the northern elder who moved first. Kyle told her over breakfast, his face carefully organized into the version of itself that meant the information was serious, and he had already processed the first layer of it and was presenting it to her cleanly. Emmerich the Elder has made a formal challenge, not to the marriage itself, to the process. He's claiming the signing was not properly witnessed by a neutral party. Nora put down her cup. Is he right? He has grounds to raise the question. Whether he has grounds to sustain it depends on interpretation of the old code. He paused. There are those who would support his interpretation because it serves their interests, regardless of what the code actually says. What happens if the challenge is sustained? The marriage would be considered provisional, which in practical terms means unprotected, which means you become vulnerable. We both become vulnerable. He said it without drama. The challenge is to the house as much as it is to the marriage. She was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about the night of the signing, the room, the witnesses, the elderly man behind the desk, the specific care that had been taken. Who were the witnesses? She asked. He told her their names. She recognized none of them. Are they neutral parties? 2 are members of my house. 1 is an independent arbiter licensed under the old code. He paused. It is the 3rd that Emmerich is contesting. The independent arbiter. Yes, his status is being challenged on a technicality. She looked at him. What kind of technicality? A bureaucratic one. The certification of his license to act as arbiter under the code requires renewal every 50 years. His last renewal was 49 years and 11 months ago. Emmerich's legal team is arguing that the renewal had not yet occurred at the time of signing. Nora stared at him. 1 month. Less than 1 month. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That's incredibly thin. It is thin. He met her gaze. But thin doesn't mean ineffective. In old code challenges, the process itself is the weapon. The longer it runs, the more expensive in terms of political capital, the more opportunity for those on the fence to find reasons to side with the challenge rather than against it. She pushed her plate aside. "Tell me everything you know about the old code." He told her. It took most of the morning. She spent the afternoon in the library, not designing, reading everything in the section she'd identified on the third day as organized under the emotional register of obligation, which turned out to be legal texts, histories of precedent, records of old challenges, and their resolutions. She had no training in this. She had a graphic designer's eye for structure and a lifetime of managing systems by understanding what they were actually for beneath what they claimed to be for. At 5 o'clock, she had 3 pages of notes. She found KL in the study. "The challenge isn't about the witness," she said. He looked up. "The technicality is a vehicle." She sat down across from him and put her notes on the desk between them. "Emmerich isn't interested in the marriage process. He's interested in the precedent. If he can establish that your decisions can be challenged on procedural grounds, he creates a mechanism. He uses it once, and it doesn't need to succeed. He just needs it to establish that it can be used." KL was very still. "So if you fight it on the technicality," she continued, "you're playing the game on his terms. You're arguing about the license renewal date, which is an argument you might win and might not, and either way you've established that his mechanism works." He looked at her. "What would you argue instead?" She met his eyes. "You don't argue the process. You argue the substance. You agree that process matters, you honor that concession, it costs you nothing, and then you demonstrate that the substance of the signing was so comprehensively witnessed that the procedural question is moot. You don't defend. You expand." A long silence. "You call additional witnesses," she said. "Anyone who was present at the event who can confirm the agreement was made publicly and in good faith. You file that testimony independently of the formal signing documentation. And then you ask the code authority, not Emmerich's legal team, to rule on whether the expanded testimony constitutes sufficient substantiation." He leaned back in his chair very slowly. "You strip the technicality of its power," she said, "by making the evidence so broad that no single point of procedural failure can invalidate it. You're talking about outflanking him. I'm talking about design." She tapped her notes. "When a system has a point of failure, you don't reinforce the point of failure. You build around it until the failure point is no longer load-bearing." He looked at her across the desk, and in his expression she saw the thing she had been watching form slowly over the past weeks, the careful uncaging. The shift in the quality of his attention from assessment to something else. Something that didn't have a name yet, but was moving toward one. "How do you know how to do this?" he said. "I don't," she said honestly. "I know design. The logic is the same." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, he picked up his pen. They worked until midnight. The code authority ruled in 48 hours. Expanded testimony substantiated. Procedural challenge insufficient to invalidate substance of agreement. The ruling came in language so dense and formal that it took Nora 2 readings to be certain she'd understood it correctly. But the meaning was clear. Emmerich's challenge had failed. Kyle received the ruling in the study, read it twice, set it down. He looked at Nora across the table where they'd worked for 2 days straight, on coffee, and the particular sustained energy of people who are doing something that matters. He said, "It worked." She said, "Of course, it worked." And then, because she was exhausted and the relief was flooding through her in a wave that was unexpectedly physical, she laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that surprised her by arriving. He looked at her when she laughed, and his face did the thing it had been increasingly doing, the uncaging, and he smiled. A real smile. Not brief, and slightly surprised the way his smiles had been at the beginning. A full one, unheld, and she saw in it the person he was when the careful management fell away, and he was warm and sharp and present, and she felt the ground shift under her, in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She stopped laughing. They looked at each other across the table. Neither of them moved. He said, "Quietly, Nora." She said, "I know." Because she did know. Had been knowing for some time. In the incremental accumulating way she knew things, pieces arriving, and being placed, and building into a picture that was becoming impossible to look at as anything other than what it was. She said, "I'm not going to pretend I don't feel what I feel, but I also need to tell you that I'm not staying because I feel it. I was staying before I felt it." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why it matters." She came around the desk. Not performed, not romantic in the constructed sense, just movement, a decision, the body doing what it had been arguing for long enough. She stood in front of him, and he stood up, and he was close enough that she could see the deep watercolor of his eyes, and all the complexity in them, the centuries, and the grief, and the careful management, and underneath, all of it, the thing that had been there since the subway, the gold thread of something that had been waiting to be seen. He raised his hand and touched her face. The same deliberate care he applied to everything, permission in the movement, choice in every millimeter of it. She leaned into his hand. He said her name again, just her name, the way it sounded when it meant something. She kissed him, and the house around them was very still, as though it had been holding its breath for 3 weeks and had finally been given permission to exhale. They talked for a long time after, in the low firelight of the study, the ruling on the table forgotten, the world outside the windows dark and quiet. He told her things he hadn't told her before, not strategically, not in the organized briefings of the early weeks, but freely, the way you talk when the reason to guard against someone has dissolved. She told him things too, about Phoenix and the fire escape and the design degree, and the way her whole life had been a series of doors she'd stood in front of and not known whether to go through until the decision made itself. She said, "I don't regret signing." He said, "I know you didn't at first." She shook her head. "I mean from the beginning. Even when I was angry about the way it happened, even when I was figuring out what I'd agreed to, I don't think I ever regretted it." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I was afraid to hope for that." She looked at him sideways. "You were afraid?" He smiled, the real one. "Occasionally. Don't tell anyone." In the garden the following week, she planted something new. Peonies, from the kitchen garden seed store, which had been maintained against possibility like all the other things in this house. They were slow to establish. They needed years to reach their full bloom. They were not for now, but for what came after now, which was its own kind of statement. Kyle sat on the stone bench and watched her plant them. He said, "You're assuming we'll be here to see them." She pressed the soil down over the roots with both hands. "I'm assuming we'll have the choice." He was quiet. She looked up at him. He said, "When the 7 years ends." She met his eyes across the garden. "I know what I want." She paused. "I want you to know that before you ask, so it doesn't feel like an answer to a question. It feels like what it is." He looked at her with the full depth of those deep water eyes, and she saw in them the thing she had been watching grow, the settled warmth of someone who had stopped bracing against the good thing and was finally, carefully, beginning to let himself have it. He said, "I want you to know the same." She went back to the peonies. The garden moved in the wind around them, the old roses and the new planting and the trees that had outlived their purposes and continued anyway, growing without instruction, the way the best things did. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing in this world was simple. She had learned that quickly. In the way you learned the texture of a new material by working with it, you didn't know its true character until you had pressed against it from several directions. The challenge from Emmerich had failed, but it had opened a conversation in the wider network of houses, and conversations in this world had long half-lives. There were meetings and delegations and evenings where she sat beside KL in rooms full of very old people with very old agendas, and she had learned by now to move in those rooms with the ease of someone who understood them not belonging to them, never pretending to belong, but fluent, in the way she had become fluent in the manner itself, by paying attention and staying honest about what she saw. She kept designing. The freelance work had grown into something more intentional. She had started taking on commissions for companies connected to Kyle's network, identity work, and visual strategy, the design of things that needed to communicate trust without explaining themselves. She was good at it, better than she'd been before, because she now understood in her bones the difference between surface and substance, and that understanding made her work more precise. Vera brought her tea in the library one afternoon and said, without preamble, "You've become someone this house recognizes." Nora looked up. "Is that different from belonging to it?" Vera considered. "The house belonged to you from the day you arrived. The recognition is you, not the house." She poured the tea. "It's knowing you can leave and choosing the rooms you're in." Nora thought about that for a long time. On an evening in early autumn, she and Cale walked the grounds after dark. They did this sometimes now, a habit grown of the garden afternoons extending into the evenings as the nights came earlier, neither of them having decided to start doing it, and neither of them having considered stopping. The grounds in autumn were extraordinary, the trees turning in colors that the amber indoor light couldn't compete with, gold and deep red, and the particular orange of old maples, and the air sharp and carrying the smell of wood smoke from the house's chimneys. She had been thinking about something for several days. She said, "I want to understand what I am here, not in the formal sense, not the legal title." She paused. "I want to understand what you would like me to be." He was quiet for a while, walking, then he said, "My wife, first. That's not a small thing in this world, despite how it may have felt at the beginning." She waited. "My partner," he continued, "in the actual sense, not as a front for the house. In decisions, in what we build here." He looked at her. "You've already been that. I'm asking you to know that I see it." She accepted that. "What else?" He stopped walking. She stopped with him. He turned to face her, and in the dark his eyes held the ambient light of the October garden, and she had long since stopped being surprised by the depth of what was in them. "Someone I am learning how to stay for," he said. "Not the house, not the obligation. Someone I am learning to stay for because I want to, not because the old code requires it." She looked at him. She said, "That took a long time for you to say." "I know." His jaw moved slightly. "I've been careful for a very long time." "I know," she said. "I know you have." She reached up and touched the same point on his face that he had first touched on hers, the same calibration of permission, and he held very still and let her. She said, "I'm not going anywhere. Not in 7 years. Not in 70. I made a decision. I don't walk back from decisions when the reason I made them turns out to be real." He covered her hand with his. The October garden was around them, smelling of wood smoke and turning leaves and the deep green scent of the old roses making their last growth before winter, and the house beyond them with its amber-lit windows was full of the life she had built here, the work in the library afternoons and the garden mornings and the long evenings in the study, the slow assembling of a self that had started to fit differently in the world, not smaller, not larger, but truer. She thought about the eviction notice. She thought about it all the way at the back of her mind, the way you think about a storm that has passed not with fear, but with a kind of gratitude for the specific path that the danger cut through your life, the precise way it moved you from one place to another. She had signed a document in a firelit room for $10,000 and the protection of a roof. She had not signed it for this, for the October dark and the amber windows and the hand over hers, warm with the warmth of something that had learned to stop holding itself at distance. But this was what the signing had become. She leaned against him. He held her, carefully, The way he had learned to hold the things that mattered. Not gripping. Not controlling. Just present. Just there. Above them, the October sky was immense and full of stars and very old. And Nora Chen, who had sat in a dark apartment 4 months ago with a $4,000 deficit and a degree that hadn't worked, and a life that had been slowly narrowing, stood in a garden of deep autumn color and felt the particular expansive certainty of someone who had walked through a door without knowing what was on the other side and found it despite everything. Because of everything exactly wide enough, she said, "I would have done it anyway." Done what? All of it. Even if the money hadn't been what it was. If I'm honest, she felt him shift, just slightly, looking down at her. I would have said yes anyway. Why? She was quiet for a moment. "Because you looked sad," she said finally. "And I gave a sad stranger my number, and I have never once regretted following a thing through to where it actually went." He was quiet for a long time. Then he pressed his lips to the top of her head, and the garden held them both, the old roses and the new peonies, and the trees that continued beyond their purposes, growing without instruction, alive in the autumn dark, reaching toward whatever came next.